ladies and gentlemen, and others.
So thank you, David Barry, for that introduction. Welcome to my LGBT history show. And today we're going to be talking about the 20th century. Now, this is pretty much a tumultuous period of time when everything sort of started to happen. This was the battleground against discrimination, harassment, victimization, basically hanging. Well, hanging had stopped. The 19th century saw an end to hanging in the United Kingdom. Still, unfortunately, still going on. 71 countries in the world still criminalize people for being LGBT. 11 still hang people. And 35 of the countries that criminalize people for LGBT are part of the original British Commonwealth. So they're still criminalizing us because of British laws, which we exported to them. So today I'm going to be looking through that whole period of what happened, how everything came together. As the century turned, the term homosexual had just been invented. Richard Kraft-Ebing had coined the phrase. It was a while before it would actually start becoming popular, but there was this big, huge shift taking place. Psychology was becoming a big thing. This, Carl Jung and all the Freud, all of these people were around. And so we're going to look a little bit at some of the challenges that were taking place in the 21st century. Whoops, just found my thing. And this is one of the most important things that happened just at the end of the 19th century was the introduction of the Gross Indecency clause. It was called the Labouchere Amendment. It changed the whole way in which people who were gay, particularly, were treated. Up until this amendment, the crime was sodomy or buggery, and that had to be proved. And the people opposed to LGBT people, opposed to homosexuality, were having difficulty proving that actually some level of anal sex had taken place. So gross indecency meant that they could now basically take someone to court, charge them with any act that was perceived to be offensive. Walking down the street, holding hands with another man, being flirtatious with another, any kind of male-to-male relationship issue, anything could immediately be grabbed and used. Even what people said, information that had come as a result of someone being at someone's house. People could go to court and say, yes, I saw them do this. And that was going to be enough to result in someone being charged. Now, it wasn't a long charge. It wasn't like life imprisonment for gross indecency, but it was pretty heavy. The first well-known person to be charged under this was Oscar Wilde, and he was sentenced to 2 years hard labor at Reading jail. And it was pretty awful. He never really recovered. He left when he came out of jail in 1897, went to Paris, and he died by 1990 as a result of the impaired health that had come about from being imprisoned. Lots of arguments about that. So there we were into the 20th century with this awful piece of legislation now hanging around, which would stay throughout the whole of the 20th century. People were consistently being arrested, being charged, being sent to prison on the grounds of gross indecency, and that would put them on the sex offenders register. That made them a sex offender, and that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. Until basically till we get to the 21st century. And I'm going to look at that. So let's have a look at some of the highlights. Now, the problem is so much happened in the 20th century. I'm going to pick various different highlights, things that I found quite interesting. I probably won't pick everything, but if I miss something, please do. If you're listening in, put a comment in. I'm seeing one or two. I've got one comment if I find my cursor and get it to work. Right, don't understand that message. I've got a message, but I can't understand it. So I'm sure that must mean something in another language. It looks as if it's come from Russia. So sorry, I can't understand your comment, but there we go. We'll keep going. So here we are, Magnus Hirschfeld, the grandfather of transgenderism, but also gay rights activist. He was probably the first real gay rights activist who put together a campaign and got people campaigning against, in his case, paragraph 175 of the German Penal Code. In France, things in France have been quite easy because of Napoleon, who had brought out the Napoleonic Code back in the 18th century that had decriminalized homosexuality, and that had affected quite a lot of French-influenced territories. Not all of them, and certainly definitely not Britain, where we were resisting like mad, didn't like the whole idea. So Hirschfeld built the Institute of Sexology, effectively, in Berlin. State created it in 1910. He wrote a book in which he introduced the term transvestism. This has been a bit of a battle. Havelock Ellis and other psychologists had wanted to use the term eonism from the Chevalier Dion de Beaumont. I talked about that last week. Eonism didn't catch on. Transvestism did. And that was popularized. Hirschfeld also introduced it by 1923, the term transsexual, but that didn't catch on until much later. In fact, it was well into the 60s before the term transsexual started to become a popular term. And transvestite was the term that was used largely to describe anyone who cross-dressed, whether that was male to female or female to male. The term transvestite then applied to both. It subsequently became much more something applied to mostly older men dressing as female. But I'll come back to that when we look at some of the other personalities in the later years. But Hirschfeld also was the first person to start working and supporting, one of the first people to start working and supporting people who wanted to transition their bodies from male to female, female to male. So we had this acceleration in medical support. And probably the most famous we'll come to in a minute. Whoops, got a file come up I don't want. There we go. Let's look at that. Hirschfeld was actually involved in a small film, and this is probably the very first film that was ever produced about homosexuality. I'll just show you a quick clip of it. It's a very old movie. So there we go, different from others. It was the first film that openly addressed the issue of homosexuality. And you know, it's a much longer film. I've got little bits of clips here. You can find it on YouTube. Different from others. It includes a cameo from Magnus Hirschfeld, talking about the issues of being gay and really saying to someone it's okay to be homosexual. It's not a problem, and you can live your life okay. But you live your life in secret, and that's the big challenge all the time with homosexuality. Right the way through this, and we can see there, even in that movie, the whole pressure by peers to conform, to be with girls, and the sheer horror in his face when he's suddenly accosted by women. So let's have a look now. Hirschfeld also was the man who worked with Ina and Gerda Wagner. Now, you may or may not have heard of them, but if you saw the film Danish Girl, featuring Eddie Redmayne a few years ago, that's the story of Lily Elbe. Ina Wagner was a painter, and so was his wife Gerda. One day, Gerda had a problem. One of her clients hadn't turned up for a sitting, and so she asked Ina if he would just wear the dress so that she could fill the painting, and basically had to get fully dressed up. And well, he loved it. Decided actually he wanted to dress more and more as a girl, actually wanted to be a girl, and it was the help of Magnus Hirschfeld that he was put in touch with the surgeons who could help it. Hirschfeld effectively supervised that whole process. 4 lots of surgery. The last was actually a womb or a uterus transplant. We don't even do that today. So it was Ina desperately wanted to have a baby. Gerda was also an artist, and quite well-known artist. Her paintings, sometimes a little bit full on. So it tells us something about the kind of lifestyle that they were involved in. But the paintings of Lily became very famous, and in some ways almost started to not dictate, but influence fashions in the 1920s when this was all taking place. And the whole boyish look, the slim boyish look, came very much from the paintings of Gerda, which were being published everywhere. Sadly, she died in 1931 as a result of the of infections from the surgery. She had written a lot of notes, and a book was written on the basis of those, and then later that book was turned into the novel based upon her story, The Danish Girl, which then became the basis of the film. So that was the first really public transsexual person, the first someone who literally physically changed their body from male to female, and it became a huge story everywhere. She wasn't the very first trans. The first trans person, first person to have surgery, actually was a trans man, someone transitioning from female to male. So let me now have a look at a little bit later. A lot of people will know Mae West, but probably won't know of her connection with the gay community and the fact that she was also a playwright. Mae West was literally on the vaudeville stage by the time she was 14 years old. She'd been performing at social clubs from the age of 5. Encouraged by her mother, who was very much a supportive of that. But she particularly caught the eye of producers because of her quick wit and cutting remarks, for which she became very famous. But she also wrote some plays, and those plays became quite... oops, I've just lost my... there we go. So, warning, if you cannot stand excitement, see your doctor before visiting Mae West. Her shows were pretty raucous and pushed the boundaries. And she produced a film, a play called Sec. She was arrested after a program called The Drag. But also she wrote a play called Pleasure Man. A Pleasure Man was all about what was happening backstage in the vaudeville theatre. Now, I talked last week about the influence of vaudeville and the fact that drag had become very much the part of the mainstay of vaudeville theatre. People loved to go and see female impersonators, men who transitioned into or transformed themselves into beautiful women. And there was an assumption that these were just ordinary heterosexual men who suddenly liked to dress on stage as women. Of course, that wasn't always the case. A lot of these people lived often in a very feminine way, were very camp gay people. They were involved in gay relationships. That all happened backstage, out of sight. But what Mae West did was to put that on stage. And actually, her play was about the relationships going on between men in the vaudeville theatre. And it caused a big stir. In fact, when Pleasure Man was put on, it was shut down almost immediately. The police rushed in, shut the whole thing down, arrested all the cast. Mae West actually funded and financed everybody's court cases and made sure everybody was looked after, nobody got damaged. She became so successful that at one stage, she was the richest woman in America and was very much a part of the whole growth of Hollywood. But very, very positive gay people, very positive in terms of writing plays to promote a positive attitude towards homosexuality. Now, everything was going okay until we got to the war. Magnus Hirschfeld had built his Institute for Sexology. He had created a huge library of books. And I'm just going to show again a short video because I think it's important to understand what happened. Hirschfeld in Germany was aware of the problems that, there we go, I keep losing my cursor here. Let's just have a look at this.
In Berlin, wie in anderen Universitätsstädten Deutschlands, wurden undeutsche und unsittliche Bücher von den Studenten eingesammelt und öffentlich verbrannt. Der Scheiterhaufen auf dem Opernplatz in Berlin. Reichsminister Dr. Goebbels spricht zur Jugend. Meine Kommilitonen!
So that was Hermann Göring at a rally in Berlin. That was on the 10th of May. On the 6th of May, as the Nazis took power, the Hitler Youth targeted, first of all, Magnus Hirschfeld's Institute of Sexual Studies. They took all the books, they confiscated files about gay men, and it happened. Hirschfeld was in America on tour when it took place. When he returned, he went to the south of France and died in 1937, never returning to Germany. Gay men, and I think this is something that people don't get because people think of the Holocaust as targeting Jewish. And yes, the primary target of the Holocaust was Jewish people in Germany, Poland, and elsewhere. But it was also gay men who were significantly targeted by the Germans. They were arrested and put in special camps. Many of them were sent to camps where they were used for medical experimentation. They call it the Holocaust. It was 50,000 gay men, trans women would have also been treated as gay men, were arrested and put into the camps, used for medical experimentation, using various different treatments. They were looking at ways, conversion therapy, how could they how could they convert people from being gay to being straight? And all of these experiments were done on a group of gay men, used for all sorts of reasons. What's even worse is that at the end of the war, when the Allies found the concentration camps and liberated everyone, anyone who wore a pink triangle, the pink triangle was the symbol for being gay, yellow for Jewish, brown for gypsies, and so on. anyone who was wearing a pink triangle, anyone who was identified as being there because they were gay, were immediately reinterred by the British and Americans in British and American camps and prisons to continue to serve a prison sentence for being gay, because that was against the law in Britain and America. So, yeah, pretty awful to be liberated from a concentration camp only to be reinterred in prison for up to 10 years because you're in breach of British and American law. So after the war, we started to see some changes taking place. There are more and more people start to come out. This is an interesting story about Billy Tipton, jazz musician, who after the war was married 5 times. Only one, apparently, knew anything about the fact that he was born female. Everybody struggles to understand, but he had explained to them he'd been involved in explained to all the people he married, or women he married, that he had been in a really serious accident, which had meant his genitals had been mutilated. And they believed that. It was only on his death, when there was actually a post-mortem conducted, that they discovered that he was actually born female. Now, there's been lots of arguments about this. Was he a man? Was he a trans man? Or was he basically a lesbian woman forced to have to live as a man in order to enjoy the life of being a jazz musician? Women just didn't go into being jazz musicians. It's difficult to argue this, but there are so many opportunities that Billy had to actually have come out and told everybody. He didn't. And he kept it a secret. He didn't want anyone to know that he was actually female-bodied. I think he was a trans man and lived as a trans man. Didn't have surgery, but there we go. That's Billy Tipton. Now, Harry Benjamin was also a very influential person in terms of the trans community after the war. Magnus Hirschfeld had been to visit him before the war, and they'd had good conversations. Benjamin, also German, had taken up the mantle of being the supporter of trans people, particularly in America. And he put together what became the standards of care for the way in which trans people should be treated, male to female and female to male, who want to go a medical transition, have their bodies altered. The organization he set up, the Harry Benjamin International Gender Dysphoria Association, is now called the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, and is still the world's leading authority in supporting trans people and putting together the standards of care, the details by which doctors are guided. And he was a friend of Christine Jorgensen, one of his first patients, and Christine Jorgensen, one of the most famous trans people. In 1952, she underwent surgery, in her case, in Denmark. She was a GI, had gone to Denmark, had the surgery, come back, and it had been outed. And she arrived back, the whole world now knew. Everybody wanted to know because she was actually an extremely beautiful woman, and everybody was wanting to find out. I've seen videos of the press, and the way they hounded her was horrendous. But all credit to her, she decided that if she was out, she was going to do what she could to raise awareness and help other trans people. And she became an advocate and lived until 1989, promoting and supporting trans people and promoting a positive agenda for trans people. Because at the time, and I remember I was born in 1950, but by the time we got to the 1960s, I do remember being trans myself, seeing the way in which trans people were humiliated by the press, photographs over, their lives destroyed, their families rejecting them, because nobody wanted to be associated with that kind of stigma that was attaching to anybody who transitioned. So a very difficult task she took on board, and I'm grateful that she did. So in 1957, we also started to see pressure beginning to build to decriminalize homosexuality. The battle was a huge, raged fiercely. But what had happened because of gross indecency, because basically somebody could be arrested and charged with gross indecency for almost the slightest of things, just appearing to be a little bit too familiar with another man in public was enough for somebody to be challenged. People could effectively report them, and they could be arrested and charged. And it became known as the Blackmailers Charter. Alan Turing was also one of the high-profile people who was charged under gross indecency. Alan Turing, a mathematician and cryptologist, who had been responsible for basically helping Britain to crack the Enigma code, the German secret code, enabling the British to know a lot more about German troop movements, ship movements, of what was going on and what was happening, and was a brilliant mathematician who probably was the founder of computer science as we know it today. Having single-handedly with his team, people have said he probably shortened the war by 2 or 3 years. Some believe that we may even have struggled to win the war because without the shipping coming in, without the provisions coming in from America, it would have been very difficult for Britain to hold out against Germany if we had no food. But in 1952, Turing was arrested, charged. He was offered the option of either going to prison or being chemically castrated. That means injected with estrogen so that it would reduce his sexual libido. And he chose that route. But by 1954, decided to take his own life. And not long after that, we then had more high-profile people. Lord Montagu was arrested and charged with gross indecency. And what was happening is it was anybody who was wealthy, very well known, high profile, was a target for blackmailing. And that started to put pressure on the government to do something to decriminalize homosexuality. And eventually it happened. Now, before that happened, around at the same time, what we were seeing was a growing number of people beginning to come out as cross-dressers, transvestites. Now, I think people get very confused with the whole idea of transvestite. I did some research when I did my master's degree, talking to people who identified as transvestites, that is, men who cross-dressed, mostly at weekends. They went out for socialized as a woman, but actually still worked and lived as men. Most were married, most had children, and kept what they were doing very, very secret. Once again, we're into those areas where people can be caught out, can be blackmailed, and being discovered to be trans, even if it was just as a result of a careless word or somebody seeing you somewhere and telling everybody, that was enough to get you sacked from your job. That was enough to basically for the family to reject you. So Virginia Prince in America set up an organization to support trans women, basically, or to support men who like to cross-dress but weren't prepared to go the whole way and fully transition. Because the journey of transition to completely transition and live as a woman instead of, or live as a man instead of a woman, was a very difficult one. It wasn't socially acceptable. It would almost certainly result in loss of job, loss of status, loss of family, rejection by family. And so people tended just to keep it quiet, keep it social. Marriage was a good cover for being gay. It was a good cover for being trans. Lots of people did that. I did it. So she set up an organization. She lived as a man and then cross-dressed. Then as she got older, she decided that she'd had enough of that. She was going to live as a woman, but didn't intend to undergo any level of surgery. And she said, I'm not transvestite, I'm not transsexual. And she coined the term, or at least popularized the term transgender, the term that we use today. So that's where the term transgender came from. So we've had Hirschfeld popularizing the term transvestite. Harry Benjamin was the one who popularized the term transsexual. Other people used it, but it was Benjamin who really popularized it. And Virginia Prince, who popularized the term transgender. This is where all these terms have come from, terms that, the language that we use today, which just simply didn't exist. In 1967, decriminalisation of homosexuality. Now, the problem with this is that everybody thinks that decriminalisation meant that it was okay to be gay. Well, there were some rules, very strict rules. It was partial decriminalisation because you had to be over the age of 21. Then 21 was the age of consent. That changed in 1970. So you had to be over 21. You had to be consenting to it. So anybody who was involved in a sexual encounter with another man who didn't consent, that was immediately gross indecency again. It had to be in private. Now, the courts interpreted in private very, very strictly. And what that meant was no one else in the building. So it wasn't just a matter of being private in a room. Even if you were in a hotel, there were other people in the hotel, that wasn't considered to be in private. So what started to happen was that hotels would wait until two men had gone into a room and then phone the police. The police would then arrive, break into the room, find two men. Now, they only had to be in a slightly compromising position for them to immediately charge them with gross indecency. And that happened. In fact, arrests for gross indecency tripled following the Sexual Offences Act of 1967. So changing the law had taken a huge amount of effort, but changing the underlying attitudes, that took so much longer. The police were really, really not supportive. I know that for myself in the 60s and 70s, if I was cross-dressed, there was no way I ever wanted any encounter with the police because I knew it would almost certainly result in me being arrested for impersonating a woman with some idea that I was impersonating a woman in order to take advantage of women. There was a very, very negative attitude towards anything that meant crossing gender boundaries. So harsher penalties were actually introduced for gross indecency in public. So although 1967 saw a watershed, it wasn't the end of the problems in terms of what was going on in the United Kingdom. Now, I think we need to get the context of this because I think people think back, it's a long time ago. 1967 was the summer of love. That was the time when the whole hippie movement had started. I was 17 at the time. And in 1969, I was at Butlins Redcoat. And while I was at Butlins on the 27th of June, something was happening in New York, which was going to be a major problem. Judy Garland had died, and it was her memorial. Now, in Greenwich Village, in Christopher Street, there was one bar which was very open to men dancing with men and women dancing with women and people wearing whatever clothes they wanted. So, trans women and trans men would come in, butch lesbians and camp gay. It was a mixture of all manners of genders of people coming in, all sexualities, bisexual, homosexual, gay, lesbian. It was a bit of a mucky place, apparently. There was no running water, so they just swilled out glasses in a bucket. It was run by the mafia. They had a deal with the police. The police would raid the place every once a week or once a month. I think it was once a month on a regular basis. But they usually informed them in advance. But for some reason, on the 27th of June, 1969, they didn't. What happened was that they decided that they were going to close the Stonewall Inn down completely. And so they arrived with the Black Mariahs and poured in. And what they did was to line everybody up who looked as if they might not be the gender that their clothes said. So in America, in New York, it was against the law for a man to be wearing women's clothes. They had to be wearing at least 3 items of male clothing. If you had a male body and if you were female, you had to be wearing at least 3 items of female clothing. And you would be checked. So all of the trans women and drag queens were lined up in order to be checked by a member of the police force to check and see did their genitals match the clothes they were wearing. And normally they just capitulated and agreed to it. But this night, a strange atmosphere existed in Greenwich Village, or so I'm told. I wish I'd been there. But anyway, everybody poured out onto the street who wasn't going to be arrested, but hung around. They didn't leave. People came and joined them. The people upstairs said, no, not going to be checked. You're not going to do that. So having put everybody out on the streets, Sylvia Rivera, well-known trans woman and trans activist, was there. Marsha P. Johnson wasn't. Apparently, she turned up about an hour later when everything was beginning to kick off. But this was a regular haunt for lots of well-known trans, gay, lesbian people. And to this night, they just weren't going to settle down. They weren't going to allow the police to push them around anymore. So having pushed the people out into the streets, they then started to put trans women into the Black Mariahs to take them downtown to the police station. Somebody started to rock the Black Mariah. Somebody started throwing coins in allusion to the payoffs to the mafia. When they ran out of coins, they started throwing bricks and bottles. The police retreated back into the Stonewall Inn. A window got smashed. Somebody poured lighter fuel over it and lit that. So the whole thing started to burn. It never turned into a serious fire, but it was enough that the police panicked, hit the panic button, and in came the riot police. And Greenwich Village was turned into 3 days of rioting as the gay community made it very clear they were not going to be pushed around anymore. It all settled down, but this was the start. Out of the Stonewall riots came the Gay Liberation Front and a movement. The Black rights movement had already started building up in the 60s, and here we were at the end of the 60s with the gay community seeing what had happened there and actually responding positively to it. The following year, a gay pride march, the first ever gay pride march, took place on Christopher Street to basically remember what had happened, to remember that day, and to keep things going. Because, there had been a flashpoint, but there was still a lot to happen. There was still a lot that needed to go on. It was 2 years later that the first gay pride march happened in London, and we've been having gay pride marches ever since. And of course, now gay pride marches are across the world. Every city, almost every city, every small town in the world now has gay pride marches, but they have slightly changed. But I'm going to come to how things moved on in a minute. So by the mid-70s, the gay pride flag started to appear, and I'm going to just pull up again. I've got another little video here just to have a look at. I wish my cursor keeps vanishing. Let's have a look at this.
The rainbow flag is a worldwide symbol of the LGBT community, but its birthplace is in San Francisco, and its creation is thanks to a man named Gilbert Baker. Baker moved to San Francisco as an Army draftee in 1970. It was there that he became acquainted with Harvey Milk and the gay rights movement. After sewing many banners for gay events and marches, the San Francisco Gay and Lesbian Pride Parade commissioned him to design a symbol that could be used for years to come. And this is what Baker came up with, the original rainbow flag.
The rainbow is a beautiful part of nature, all of the colors, and even the colors you can't see. So that really fit us as a people because we are all of the colors. Our sexuality is all of the colors. We're all the genders and races and ages.
Each color represents something different. Pink for sex, red for life, orange for healing, yellow for sunlight, green for nature, turquoise for art, indigo for harmony, and violet for the human spirit. The flag later evolved to have 6 stripes. Turquoise was swapped for blue, and pink and indigo were taken out. And decades later, the flag can still be seen waved proudly from nearly every pride parade and march around the world.
So there we go. That's the gay pride flag, which has become the symbol of the LGBT community everywhere. So we've got labels that have come in, have now come. By the time we get to the 1970s, we've got this big iconic symbol now, and then we start getting a few other things start to happen. April Ashley, a trans woman, had transitioned in the early 60s, married Lord Arthur Corbett, and it was not a very long-lasting marriage. It lasted about 6 days. But April, who sadly died last year, April wanted a little bit of maintenance, and the family realized if there was a divorce, a proper divorce, they were going to lose a lot of money. They were worth a few million, and didn't want her to take all that. They did some investigation, realized she hadn't actually changed her gender. Not clear exactly whether she could have or not, but she hadn't. And so this went to court, and Judge Ormeron, the judge who of the High Court or the House of Lords, determined that no one can ever change their sex. And that was a judgment made at the highest court in the land. He annulled the marriage on the grounds that she was actually male and same-sex marriages were not allowed, and therefore that was the end of it. But that decision really was a difficult decision, because it now meant that no trans woman could change their gender, no trans woman could get married. And it placed a huge challenge on the whole trans community. Trans men and trans women were unable to, a lot of people just went into stealth, didn't tell anyone, and if they weren't required to produce a birth certificate at any stage, they could probably cope without any problems. But it now imposed a major problem. One person who didn't like this was Stephen Whittle. Stephen Whittle, a trans man in a relationship, was unable to be shown as the father of his children. The children were, his wife had given birth. It was IVF, but he couldn't be shown because he was legally female. He could not go on the birth certificate as the father. Christine Burns, a trans woman, also got together with Stephen because they were uncomfortable with the fact that these rules were now constraining trans people, preventing them from living full and active lives, preventing them from getting married, preventing them from really doing an awful lot, because it was always going to come up. If they could not change their legal gender at some point along the way, it was going to be discovered, and you could be instantly fired for being trans. So all of these rights, we didn't have any rights effectively. So Stephen, Christine, and Mark Rees, others put together an organization called Press for Change, which campaigned to change the law, to bring about the law. Now, that didn't happen in the 20th century, and I will be talking next week about what's happened in the 21st century. But for the work that they did in bringing about some of these changes, both Christine and Stephen received MBEs. They did bring about a huge amount of change. But all the time we're having, as you see, campaigns needed. Now, we got to the 1980s, and all of a sudden we're hit with the big crisis, HIV/AIDS. It started in the early 80s, suddenly a rare cancer seen amongst homosexuals. Nobody's quite sure why. It's suddenly addressing the gay community. There are lots of arguments, lots of debates over where it started and what caused it, why in Africa, why in the gay community. I personally think this is to do with a vaccine using plasma from monkeys that contain the HIV virus. A lot of gay men basically would go to centers where they could be experimented on. For some extra money, they could actually just be tested on. And I suspect that that's probably where it all started, but I'm not going to get into the battle and arguments over this. The fact is that it spread very quickly amongst the gay community. We now know, of course, that it isn't just about gay community. This is a disease which spreads through sexual contact, through transfer of fluids. And large, if you've seen It's a Sin, the recent, forgot his name for a minute, it's all gone, but the recent series on TV by Russell T Davis, you will have seen the impact that this crisis had on the gay community and on gay people. It was a pretty horrific time, and it impacted the attitude of politicians. And so we came at the end of the 1980s, partly because of the growing negative attitudes towards the gay community because of AIDS, and because of the sense that somehow this pandemic was being spread by gay people. The government decided that they were going to make a change to the Local Government Act to prevent local authorities, and particularly schools, from positively promoting and positioning homosexuality as a normal lifestyle. I'm going to pop in a little video here and we'll just have a look and see what happened, because on the day in May 1988, this is what happened.
The 6 o'clock news from the BBC with Sue Lawley and Nicholas Witchell.
6 o'clock. In the House of Lords, a vote is taking place now on a challenge to the poll tax. Tory rebels have said that the tax is
protesting about rights for lesbian and gay people.
In general, Britain was quite a hostile environment in the 1980s for the LGBT community. About 75% of people, when surveyed, said that it was mostly or always wrong to be gay. Simply by walking down the street, if somebody identified you as lesbian or gay, you could get abuse and you could be violently attacked just for being.
I obviously don't want children taught that the gay and lesbian lifestyle is natural or normal. It is not, it never has been, and it never will be.
Yes, my overriding concern is with the promotion of positive images of homosexuality in schools from primary school right through, and that is what is causing many parents real concern and offence.
There was a sort of catalyst moment where a book was published called Jenny Lives with Erica Martin, about a girl who lives with her two dads, and it sort of kicked off a moral panic in Parliament. What we were told we were doing was destroying the heterosexual family. So that lobby grew to get this clause enacted. Section 28 banned local authorities from promoting homosexuality. The second part of it banned the teaching of the acceptability of homosexuality in schools. Basically, it meant closing down of services. So young people became very vulnerable, particularly, and schools couldn't protect people from being bullied. All kinds of groups, all over the country, began to protest.
Actor Ian McKellen was at the head of a procession which stretched nearly 2 miles.
A group of lesbians chained themselves to Buckingham Palace gates, dressed as suffragettes. A group of lesbians abseiled into the House of Lords. Through all of the campaigning prior to the enactment, we could not get the media to understand what the impact was going to be on our community, on our children. So really, the only thing left was to actually be the news by being on the news. We met outside Television Centre. We managed to get through the security. The whole thing was timing, really. And as soon as the lights changed, we barged into the studio. The whole place went mad. I got smacked to the ground by don't know how many people. One of our number managed to handcuff herself to a camera, and the other one got behind the news desk where she was quite violently subdued by Nicholas Witchell, who's since apologised. Sue Lawley carried on trying to read the news.
And I do apologise if you're hearing quite a lot of noise in this studio at the moment. I'm afraid that we have rather been invaded.
In the footage, it's all got rather muffled, and you can hear little muffled shouts of, "Stop the Section 28!" And eventually we were all arrested. It did get huge media coverage. You know, the headlines were all about loony lesbians. But over time, and Beyond that, I've heard from quite a lot of people what it meant to them as young LGBT people in their own home, knowing they were gay but maybe not even out, and just felt a little bit empowered by it. So here we are in Television Centre again 30 years later. Clearly things are a lot better than they were in the 1980s, but it hasn't completely changed, and there are very dangerous and serious pockets of homophobia. We have to be in solidarity with all the communities worldwide who are in daily fear of their lives. I'm glad we did it. The fact we're here today means the story's been remembered.
So there we go. That was Section 28 of the Local Government Act, and it probably was the single most important thing in the 20th century in terms of changing activism and changing the way in which the community worked together. Because as a result of Section 28, led by Ian McKellen and a few others, Ian happened to be the most well-known, Stonewall was formed as the LGBT campaigning group. So we had Press for Change supporting rights for trans people, Stonewall supporting rights for LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual people. That has come together. Stonewall now it takes on all of that and also looks after trans and non-binary rights, and is looking generally at the whole LGBTQ community. But then it was really about about gay rights. And the campaign made a huge difference because it was well funded, it was well supported, and steadily Stonewall has managed to change attitudes and get laws changed. Of course, pretty much for the rest of the 20th century, not much happened in terms of law. Section 28 remained in place for the whole, for the remainder of the 20th century. But underneath it all, what we were seeing throughout that period as we moved from the 70s right the way through the 80s and 90s, was gender being challenged. We saw gender being challenged by people like Eddie Izzard, Boy George, David Bowie, Julian Clary, Pete Burns, and of course Quentin Crisp. All of these people presenting a very different aspect, challenging the whole idea and notions of what it meant to be male, what it meant to be female. We saw drag become really popular with Danny LaRue. The most popular show in London was the Danny LaRue show. Dame Edna Everett, Brian, sorry, his name's gone for a minute. Lily Savage, all of these characters and drag characters became extremely popular, and this was the kind of show that we were seeing for family entertainment. So even though on the one hand there was this attitude against LGBTQ people, on the other hand we were wanting them on stage, as had been the case in the 19th century and the 18th centuries. It's this strange mix, isn't it? Well, on the one hand we want to see this challenge to gender norms, but on the other hand we don't want it in our front door rooms. And of course we started to see cross-dressing in all manner of films. Tootsie became very popular. The Little Britain, Monty Python played games with it. Even Robin Williams dressed in Mrs. Doubtfire, and a whole number of films and shows came out looking at and challenging gender, allowing people to cross gender. So we've got an entertainment industry which is constantly presenting images of changing gender, of effectively putting gay images out, because we started to see gay images coming out. But at the same time, all the way through, I could be sacked for being gay, I could be sacked for being trans, I could be refused service, I could be refused access to a hotel, I could be arrested just for holding hands with someone. There were all manner of challenges and a negative attitude throughout the whole of, police and everywhere, because essentially there was a law in place which said being gay, being trans is wrong. So I've got There we go. Come on. So that's it for the 20th century LGBT. You can get this poster, which I think is a great poster, from LGBT plus History Month.org.uk. I'll put that address up in a moment. I have a tiny bit of a problem with my cursor vanishing every so often and not wanting to be there. So LGBT History Month.org.uk. That's the address to get lots and lots of material and information. And this is a really great poster which you can put up in your workplace. And it's a big long poster with all sorts of different people throughout it. People I haven't managed to be able to talk about today because there just simply wasn't enough time to get everything in. I hope that what I've been able to do has been useful and helpful and given you a little bit of an insight into LGBT history in the 20th century. 31st of March is International Transgender Day of Visibility. So if you're not organising something within the organisation for LGBT History Month, we've got the 31st of March coming up. And, please, if you're interested in me doing a talk, either now during February, you can talk to me. Just go to calendly.com, Ricky Arundel speaking -discovery-call, and you can find me there. Or you can just simply drop me an email at rickyarundel.com. I'm more than happy to arrange to talk to you about how I might be able to help to make your workplace a little bit more LGBTQ friendly. I hope that's been a useful journey through 20th century history. Remember, this is the main theme all the time. Treat everyone with dignity and respect. It's not very difficult, is it? If we just treat people with dignity and respect, except that some of people are different, and we don't have to get ourselves all knotted up in anti-attitudes. Next week, the last of my 4 presentations on LGBT history, I will be looking at the 21st century. And although there's only been 22 years of it, oh my God, what changes we have seen. In that space of 22 years, our laws have been literally turned on their head. We've gone from a time when before 1999, which actually was the first piece of legislation, before that, you could be sacked for being gay, sacked for being trans, just for telling somebody that you were. That's the world we had literally 25 years ago. You could not tell people that you were out. And today, 64% of people who are LGBTQ are still afraid to come out at work. So, even though the laws have all changed, there's still an enormous amount that still has to be done. I hope that you've enjoyed this little journey through LGBT history. Please join me next week, 3 o'clock next Wednesday, when I'll be looking at the Equality Act and the changes in all sorts of laws. So many laws got changed. We'll be looking rather at how things have changed and where we are now and what's going on that's transformed society and some of the challenges, because some people are almost frightened to know what they're able to even say. So do join me. I'm just going to get rid of a few bits and pieces here. Goodness me, there we are. So join me next week. And I look forward to talking to you about 21st century LGBT history. Take care.